changes over timescales of thousands, well, recent timescales of many thousands of years. And they're both pushing the cutting edge of these geochemical techniques and then asking and answering really interesting questions. They are currently an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. They've just started their second year, and as of June, their lab was up and running. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, we're producing data now.
So it's something to really celebrate. And before this, they were an NSF postdoctoral fellow. They had a joint appointment at Yale and Brown. Before that, did a PhD at geosciences at Penn State, and then were an undergrad just down the road at St. Louis at Washington University. So also Tyler's first time in Madison, so please give a big Madison welcome to Tyler here.
Yeah, thank you everybody. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks, Jack. Today I'm going to be talking to you about ancient wildfire dynamics on a bunch of different time scales from, thousands to tens of thousands of years, actually all the way back to the dinosaur extinction event. But I'm mainly going to be talking about it through the lens of one of the main molecular tools that we use to try to reconstruct past wildfires. So usually when I start, right? I have this in my hand, and we just had a conversation about how this is going to be your clicker, is by talking about why wildfires matter. And I feel like when I started my career and now, it's become just so evident why people care about this topic that it almost is sad to give this motivational talk. Because the first part is from a societal perspective, it's a huge natural hazard, right? And we see this every year. There's major wildfires in a lot of different places around the world, but what's on everyone's mind in the U.S. of course is the Western United States, and Canada also has been a major issue in terms of smoke pollution for the last couple summers here as well. So this is very, very clearly a recognized problem, and it's really important to understand fire from a human health and a human livelihood perspective. From more of an Earth system perspective, fire is actually a really important carbon flux with the atmosphere. So fire both is a producer of carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, but it also can sequester carbon both through regrowth, post-fire vegetation, but also through the production of pyrogenic carbon, which is an aromatized, more stable form of carbon that is actually persistent maybe on longer timescales than the general biomass pool. And then finally, from an ecology perspective, fire is also a really important ecosystem service. I think it's always fun when I get to talk about fire in the Midwest because we're really very understanding that prescribed burning is a really healthy part of maintaining our natural ecosystems. And a lot of the work I do actually is on grassland ecosystems as well. So just to kind of motivate thinking about fire on these long time scales, fire is basically a feedback between the biological system and the climate system, and these feedbacks can operate on short and long time scales with interactions between, the type of vegetation you've got in your environment, how climate influences both the vegetation you have, but also the fuel properties of that vegetation. People have effects on fire. When you get on really long time scales, atmospheric properties can have effects on fire. Including changes in oxygen content in the atmosphere. We're not going to be talking that deep in time today, but it certainly affects things if you're starting to talk about hundreds of million year time scales. Also, another thing, and Jack kind of mentioned this, is I'm really interested in studying herbivory, so the impacts of large herbivores on fire as well. So all these different things interact in really complex ways in deep time. So there's a bunch of different tools that we can use to study fire, and the one I'm really going to be focusing in on for this talk today is a suite of organic compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. I'll try to enunciate that. I'm not saying pH, I'm saying PAH. And they are basically derived from the incomplete combustion of biomass. They're relatively recalcitrant and stable because of those aromatic rings. And they're also particularly useful in other records, other paleoenvironmental records, where you're using a molecular proxy to reconstruct something about vegetation and environment. So they've got similar, taphonomic characteristics of their transport and preservation. Also some challenges associated with these guys. They can be in relatively low concentrations. They're analytically challenging to measure. And there's also, and those two we can't really do much about, but deal with them from an instrumental perspective. But these four are kind of some challenges I'm going to be addressing with some of the work we've been doing to try to improve our proxy interpretations today. So we're talking about a little bit about calibration biases, potential for mixed sourcing, understanding the isotopic signatures of these compounds, and then talking about some uncertainties in how these are transported in the environment. Okay, and the way I'm going to be doing this is by walking you through 3 different paleofire case studies. The first is going to be dealing with the expansion of grassland ecosystems in the Neogene, which is about 10 to 6 million years ago is this interval. Looking at biomarkers at the KPG boundary, so this is when the dinosaurs went extinct about 66 million years ago, and then finally ending on a more recent note, thinking about the African human period during the Holocene. So this is, you know, an interval from about 10 to 4,000 years ago, right? So different time scale on that one. So to start with the Neogene grassland fires, and thinking specifically about the expansion of C4 grassland ecosystems. So just to get everyone on the same page, C4 plants are plants that have a specific photosynthetic pathway that is adapted as a carbon concentrating mechanism. So they have both enzymatic and structural differences that allow them to fix carbon under low CO2, high temperature conditions. And this is functionally, a lot of these plants are grasses. A lot of the species that do this are grasses. But grasslands can look really different. They can have very different structural and photosynthetic characteristics. So this is a picture that I took actually at the place I went to high school in Illinois, which is a prairie, which is mostly C4 species, C3 species in this picture. This is a picture I took in Australia of a spinifex banana. So you can see there's also really different structural variations as well. From an isotopic perspective, this is actually a really fantastic tool for studying the differences in these pathways because of these differences in carbon fixation. The way that these plants actually fix carbon has a distinctive isotopic signature in carbon stable isotopes. So plants that use the C3 pathway are actually more selective for the lighter isotope. So they have these lighter isotopic values, more negative values, and C4 plants, which are less selective, have more positive or more enriched values in the heavier isotope. So this is about a 10 per mil difference, which is absolutely huge in carbon isotope world. So it's a really distinctive metric that you can use to try to reconstruct when a system maybe is shifting from a C3 dominated system to a C4 dominated system. So just some context for C4 grassland expansion. So these systems we think of as C4 grasslands, some of the prairies and grasslands in North America, especially out as you move west and south, are C4 dominated. We tend to also think of like savannas in Africa. That's kind of, I think, what pops to mind when we think of these big subtropical grassland systems. These are relatively recent systems. They only really became prominent the way that they are between about 10 to 8 million years, I guess 3 million years ago if we're talking about the youngest ones. There are a lot of questions about why this actually happened. So the C4 photosynthetic pathway evolved long before these plants became the dominant vegetation in these ecosystems. So there's a lot of questions why there's that lag, what caused it. And so it's likely some combination of a bunch of different factors, like many different Earth system events and processes. There's a lot of complex interactions. So the things that have been used to motivate this are low CO2, right, because they're carbon fixating plants. They have a special concentrating pathway, aridity, nutrient loss, and disturbance by animals and fire, which is what I'm going to be kind of focusing in on today. So the first place that C4 grassland expansion was kind of reconstructed was actually in South Asia using carbonate nodules and paleosols. And there's a very, very distinctive isotopic signal of this expansion. And so I wanted to ask the question if fire feedbacks, which we know are really important to keeping grassland systems open today, were active when these systems first opened up in the Neogene. And so, today the way that we think about this is that in these really high seasonal environments in the subtropics, you get a lot of growth in the wet season, and then that fuel dries out in the dry season, which leads to a lot of frequent fires. This potentially keeps these systems open, right? Trees, they can't escape this fire trap. The seedlings will die. And so you keep these systems open. The grasses are not shaded by the trees. And then the grasses then produce a lot of annual fuel, and it's a positive feedback loop where, you have more burning, it leads to this open system, and the grasses keep the system open by having this, high fuel ecology. So, like I mentioned, this is the first place that C4 grassland expansion was kind of recorded. In paleosol and sediment samples, this is carbon data from a structure called leaf wax and alkane. So these are plant waxes that get preserved in sediments on long time scales. And you can see there's this really distinctive isotopic signal, both in these localized paleosol sediments, but also in a record from the Bengal fan. And so what I wanted to do was go to this local record and this more regional record, and also try to reconstruct fire and actually test that hypothesis. So just to start with the paleosol sediments, we measured PAHs from these sections where N-alkanes were measured, and from some of the same samples actually that was done in that initial study. So for each of these, I'm going to briefly do an aside to some of the challenges associated with this work. So the first is that there's a forest fire calibration bias in terms of using these compounds as a marker for fire. So this is just kind of showing you like how PAHs generally, the transport pathway of our expectations from the source to the sink where we're measuring them. And this was from a review study looking at pH data from different wildfire-derived PAHs, and you can see that there is this, signal of PAHs in burned soils and ashes, but all of the data of this compilation was done in forest systems, woody systems. So if we're thinking about grasslands, I think there's been this gap where traditionally a lot of focus has been on forest fire calibration. So I just want to talk about a little work we've been doing to try to fill that gap and check our intuition here. And it's mostly been in Kruger National Park in South Africa, which is a place that I did a lot of work during my postdoc. It's, a savanna system, but it's got a really interesting both rainfall gradient and a soil gradient across the setting. So there's a lot of different types of savannas. And we're basically using a long-term burn experiment, which has been happening for about 70 years, where we have these different strings of burn plots, and they burn them at different frequencies and different seasonalities. So it's a really rich place to go where you have a very controlled fire history to try to understand how these signals are being encoded. So we sampled soils from control plots and the plots that burned every year, where we thought there'd be the biggest difference in terms of fire signal. And this was work that two senior thesis students did with me. Evie Sack at Yale did charcoal analyses in these soils, and then Presley Hernandez did a summer REU with me analyzing PAHs. So this is data that these students collected. So basically our initial question was just, do these pH concentrations in the topsoils record higher fire environments compared to just what the background concentrations are? And then we were also curious, are they reflecting the most recent fire, or are they incorporating the longer term fire history? So we used our samples. We took samples of the controls, which are never burned or haven't burned for 60 years, and then we sampled actually before and after fire events. And statistically what we found is that while there, visually you can see there's some elevated concentrations in the post-burn samples, statistically there is no difference between the pre and post-burn signals here at these plots. But there's a huge difference between the plots that haven't burned and the ones that are burning every year. Same trend is present across different landscapes. So there's 3 different landscapes we have replicates from, which is helpful. So it means that even though there's some environmental differences, this is a pretty strong persistent signal. And also just say that the charcoal concentrations have the same exact pattern as the pHs, which is a really, really good sanity check. We were also curious if pH concentrations were related to the conditions of the actual fires. people do like to use pHs to say something about how shifting fire conditions. So we had all these predictor variables from the fire that we sampled directly after, and we found there was no relationship between pH concentrations and these predictor variables. So it doesn't seem like the conditions of that fire itself. It's more the fact that there is persistent fire activity that's being encoded in these signals. So yeah, so long-term fire history, and then we also did the same thing with the 60-year average from all those sites. So we were like, oh, maybe the most recent fire isn't reporting, but the longer term conditions are. And we actually found that there was no signal there either. So I think the takeaway here is that you're getting something about fire frequency and activity, but not necessarily a lot of variability reduced by fire conditions. I actually don't think this is a bad thing. It just means that, you know, as we're incorporating these PHs as the record, they're a fire signal, but we have to be careful about how we're interpreting the fire signal. I think it's good that these variations aren't affecting them too much, because it means it's probably a better record of longer-term fire activity, and not necessarily changes in fire intensity or something like that. So it's actually, to me, I think a pretty helpful and interesting result. Yeah, and also, yeah, we can use them to say something about grassland fire. Which is also settling, since I'm a grassland fire ecologist. Okay, so jumping back to the Miocene, we have a record of the oxygen isotopes from paleosalt carbonates from these soils, which has been interpreted to reflect changes in monsoon intensity or seasonality in this record. So we know that at this site there were increases there were changes in the hydrology and likely increased drying conditions. We also have a record of carbon isotopes from the leaf waxes I mentioned before that shows that positive increase indicating the expansion of C4 grasses between 8 to 6 million years ago. And our PAH record, which I want to point out is on a logarithmic scale here, indicates that you get an increase in fire by an order of magnitude in these C4 systems. It's a pretty variable record, not necessarily surprising given that we're in these really localized soil samples. There's going to be a lot of landscape level variability here. And we asked us if we can scale these up to our marine record, which is integrating across the continent. And before I talk about that, I want to use this as a chance to talk about, I think, the biggest challenge when it comes to using PAHs as a proxy for fire, which is the potential for mixed sources. So PAHs are not just produced through biomass combustion, they're also produced through thermal maturation of carbon, which means, especially if you're thinking about them on long time scales, if you have any type of patrogenic input to your sediment, you're going to have issues with your pH interpretations, because that's also going to affect pH concentrations in addition to fire. So really dealing with this mixing problem is absolutely essential to making good interpretations of PAHs as a paleofire proxy. So this is a really well-known problem. This is something that, this is a paper, like a classic paper on this topic from 2002, and it's a well-known problem because PAHs are a pollutant from fossil fuel burning. And fossil fuel, oil contamination in the environment. And so there's a huge environmental contamination literature that deals with pH sourcing. And a lot of the literature uses these diagnostic ratios as a way of trying to fingerprint where they're coming from. I have a lot of problems with this approach because they don't always agree. So you can see just from these plots that these different ratios don't agree with each other. And the ranges are really context dependent, and all the ranges in the literature are based on modern environmental pollution. So if you're applying them to sedimentary records on million-year timescales and you're thinking about ecological processes, this is maybe not the most appropriate approach to take. I'm going to say that. But in that Sawali paper, that's exactly what we did, because it's what everyone does. And this was also the first paper I did when I was working with PAHs, and so we took the pretty typical approach, and in this setting it was appropriate, because what we found was that most of our PAHs were giving a very pyrogenic signal. So we felt pretty confident that we could make fire interpretations based on this approach. That doesn't work in the Bengal fan. So the Bengal fan, we got this really mixed signal, this like mixed petrogenic signal. And you know, when you get something like that, you're like, well, I know I can't just take this and make an interpretation because there's this mixing problem. But it's also really unsatisfying to like have done all this work, you know, expensive, time-consuming lab work, quantify all these compounds and not to be able to do anything about it. So I wanted to think a little bit critically if there were additional ways we could try to get at this sourcing problem with the PAHs and actually be able to make, you know, interpretations of our data that incorporate this uncertainty. And so the solution I came up with is also something that's kind of well known in the environmental contaminant literature, and it's this characteristic of alkylations and the number of alkylations on these compounds. So alkylations refer to the number of methyl groups that are on the aromatic ring. And they actually have really different fingerprints if you're talking about a pyrogenic process, which is a high temperature, fast process, versus a slow thermogenic process, where you're maturing carbon at a lower temperature over a long time scale. This process creates this like decreasing staircase, you'll see why I say that in a second, distribution where most of your compounds are non-alkylated and you get progressively less of the alkylated compounds. But for the petrogenic, you get this parabola where you've got more of these alkylated compounds. And so these are really distinct in terms of the characteristics of these curves. So I came up with a metric called alkylated PAH derivative index, or APDI, because we love acronym metrics in my discipline. And it's basically you fit a quadratic curve to these distributions, and you take the difference between the second and the first derivative, so the curvature and the direction of the curve. That value will give you a positive or negative value, and it allows you to at least put a number on all of this information that's preserved in that distribution. So, you know, pyrogenic has a positive value and petrogenic has a negative value. We also used a multivariate method called non-negative matrix factorization, or NMF, which is basically, it's an agnostic approach that allows you to take a complex set of data and pull out best fit end members from the data, and then take your data set and then calculate how much of each of those end members had to go into each sample to get the distribution you observe. So it's really helpful because it gives you a fractional abundance of the different end members throughout your sediment record. It, like I said, it's agnostic, so it's not like machine learning. It doesn't need a training data set. It just picks out statistically the best fit end members. So these, you'll notice, look really similar to the ones I showed you on the last page, which were based on data. These are totally agnostically picked out of our data set, but yet they're interpretable because we know that they match these end members that have meaning. And I'll also just say we just came out with a paper earlier this year in GCA, where we applied the NMF member to unmixing leaf waxes, which are a very, very commonly used tool in the paleo-environmental literature. And we basically walk through how you can apply this method, do's and don'ts, how you can, best practices for interpretation, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different applications for this that aren't just for PAHs. And I'll just end by saying that both of these agree with each other, which isn't a surprise because they're using the same data. But they basically are just reducing the dimensionality of the data set into a single dimension, a single scale. So this is our record from the Bengal fan. We've used the NMF record to correct for our pyrogenic signal, basically. So we took our pH concentrations and we said, okay, so if this proportion is coming from fires, we're going to correct it by that to account for these mixing with different sources. And what we find is that, sorry, I flipped the axes on you. So H is now on the y-axis, and our compound concentrations are on the x-axis. And this is on a log scale again, is a really similar pattern where you have an order of magnitude increase in PAHs. And I'll show you next to the leaf wax carbon isotope record from this set. You can see for grassland expansion there. And then this is a hydrogen isotope record from leaf waxes, which is another proxy for changes in hydrology. And so we're getting these same signals, and I can show you that here. So I flipped it again, and I'm showing you data from both the swags and the Bengal fan. and we actually have really similar signals at both a local and a regional scale. The regional record is much cleaner because it's incorporating a much larger area, so you're getting much more of an average, less of that local signal. So what's going on here? So really, if you dig into the pH record, there's actually these two steps happening here where you're getting about a 5 times increase in pH concentrations before grasslands expand, and then you're getting that order of magnitude shift with the expansion of grasslands. So I'm going to just walk through ecologically how we've been interpreting this. So the first thing that's happening, we think at least, is happening here, is there's this intermittent drying interval that's happening between 8 to 10 million years ago. That's in both of our hydrologic records, where you get basically a change in vegetation type that is not necessarily C4 vegetation. So we're thinking this is more of an open but yet C3 dominated landscape that is getting an increase in fire that's precipitated by this seasonal drying. But you're not yet getting the expansion of grasslands. And there's support from microfossil data from the Nepalese zoologics that this is happening. There starts to be more grass pollen, and you're getting this shift to this dry deciduous, more of a dry deciduous component over this interval. Okay, and then what we think is happening here is that the grasslands are coming in, and you're starting to get this huge increase in fire. And so we wanted to ask the question, was this increase, this order of magnitude increase, actually coming from increased burning from C4 plants? And so moving to yet another challenge, we can use the carbon isotopes of these PAHs themselves as a way of trying to get at what the source burning vegetation is. But we had some questions about how that signal was recorded, so we conducted controlled burn experiments of a bunch of different plants. We extracted the PAHs from the char residues, and we measured the carbon isotope values of the individual compounds. And what we found is that PAHs have this similar bimodal distribution to the bulk plant material that I showed you on that earlier slide, where there's that 10 per mil shift between C4-derived PAHs and C3-derived PAHs. And we were able to do this for a subset of our samples in the Bengal fan. We were constrained by the amount of material we had, so we were only able to do it in about 10 samples. But what we found is that they fell on this range, and if you code them by age, you can see that there is a distinctive shift to these more enriched C4 values. And the way that looks if you plot it through time is that you see that you start to get an enrichment in the PAHs when you're getting an enrichment in the ecosystem itself. And so we interpreted this as evidence that C4 grasses were preferentially burning at this time. So we kind of concluded that fire feedbacks and burning of C4 grasses facilitated the opening of these landscapes in South Asia. Okay, so before I kind of flip to some of our next case studies, I want to talk about yet another bias and how it can affect our interpretations of pyrogenic PAHs, and that has to do with not just the concentrations of these compounds, but the distributions of the different compounds that we measure, because there's potentially a lot of additional information preserved here. So we did a synthesis of experimentally derived pH distributions, so these were just from burn experiments. A lot of work has been done on pH distributions, but the sourcing hasn't been just from fire, so we're only looking at fire-derived pHs here. The information we had was burn phase, so if the pHs were measured in the smoke or the residue fraction, the type of plant that burned, if the experiments were conducted under atmospheric conditions or oxygen-limited conditions, and then the temperatures of the burn, the general temperatures of the burn. So we did a NMDS because our data was definitely non-parametric, so this was the appropriate method. And basically what I'm showing you here are the axes that account for the greatest amount of variation in the data set. So this is another way of reducing the dimensionality. And we had this really strong size signal on the x-axis, where the bigger PAHs are plotting out on the negative side, and the smaller ones are plotting out on the positive side. And we also tried to understand what variables might be related to this set of variability. And what we found, I think the most interesting thing, was that the temperature was not really related to pH size. And the reason this is surprising is there's a really robust literature that says that increasing aromaticity is related to temperature. And that's mostly been done based on bulk properties of burned material and sediments, not necessarily the pHs themselves. And that's been backed up with a lot of experimental data, and I think that relationship is not in question here. But for these individual compounds, there's potentially some other things that are affecting their size rather than just burn temperature. And that seems to be what comes out strongly in our data. And so what we found was that the burn phase was the strongest, the variable that had the strongest relationship between size, and that is where the pH is measured in smoke or residues. And so I think this is because the physiochemical properties of these compounds are very, very, very strongly tied to size. And these are the properties, so this is KOH, vapor pressure and solubility, that then determine their partitioning and transport in the environment. And this matters because when we're measuring them in sedimentary records, all those processes are going to be part of the signal of what actually gets incorporated into your sediments. And so what I would caution is that I'm always very cautious about studies that interpret pH size as a proxy for fire intensity, because there's a lot of other things that can affect pH size distributions. So I'm always very comforted when this type of interpretation is made with another proxy for fire intensity, like Nernite reflectance or something like that, because I'm like, okay, at least there's some agreement there. So that would be my word of warning. I would also say that we kind of used this information to come up with a ratio that we called the LMW to total ratio, the low molecular weight to total ratio, of pHs in the smoke versus residue phase. And it's a potential transport proxy because if your pHs are being transported via riverine transport or versus aerial transport, you might be able to distinguish between shifts in that using the size ratios. And we also looked at this in our burn experiment plots from Kruger. So these were in soil samples, and you can see these ratios actually are in really good agreement with our residues. So the residues, which are falling on the top of the soil and incorporated in the soil locally, have these ratios that match, just measuring the chars themselves. I'll also just say, this can potentially be affected by degradation in the environment because these low molecular weight pHs are also more degradable. So like these are the plots that haven't burned, they haven't gotten new pHs in 60 years, and you can see that that ratio is depressed even further. So when we measure these ratios in sediments, we actually tend to find that they are lower than the ones that are measured in fresh burned material. Okay, so with all that, I'm gonna move on to,
Just a clarification. So you started talking about size distributions, but up till this point, you separated things more by mass?
Yeah, sorry.
What do you mean by size?
I mean mass, actually,
Okay.
and that's important because, so in PAH world, we tend to classify PHs by the number of rings. So 2-member rings, 3, 4, or not member, but like 2, 3, 4 ring compounds. And we actually found, here, let me just quickly. You'll notice there's actually a really distinctive separation in our NMDS plot between the 202 and the 228 mass. So we are lumping the 228s with the high molecular weights, but these are all 4-ring PAHs. So a lot of people tend to lump these two groups of isomers together, and I think that's a huge mistake because if you go back and you look at the plots of the physiochemical properties, there's also a distinctive separation out in terms of how they behave in the environment too. So we actually advocate in this paper for using mass rather than the number of rings to separate out your compounds. So you're actually a really good question. Yeah. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm going to move on to the KPG burn markers. So the KPG is the mass extinction event that killed non-avian dinosaurs. It basically is the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. And this was caused by a bolide impact in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's really strong evidence supporting that. What is more up for debate is what the actual kill mechanism was in terms of the extinction itself. And so for a long time, there's been a large body of evidence indicating that there are burn markers in a lot of, and by burn markers I mean all these different things, at the KPG boundary across the world. And different people have argued that they're a marker of global wildfires. So some people have argued that basically the ejecta that rained back down after the impact ignited the whole biosphere in a global wildfire event. So that is one hypothesis for the burn marker layer. Another is that the Gulf of Mexico has a lot of hydrocarbons in it. Right? It's when you think about oil drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of mature carbon, and some people have argued that it's this excavated target rock just coming back down as part of the ejecta, that you don't necessarily need to ignite everything to get some of these types of markers, right? And PAHs are potentially a really good way of testing this, because as I mentioned before, they're actually a mixed source, right? They come from both petrogenic and pyrogenic sources. So we can use some of our tools to actually say, where were these PAHs coming from? So we measured PAHs. So these are pH concentrations, and it's been coded by the APDI index that I mentioned earlier. So this is actually a site at the crater. So this is the Peak Ring drilling project at Chicxulub. And what we found is these look very petrogenic, the ones that are at this site. And we also get, right, this bump of PAHs in the boundary. We also measured PAHs in 2 other more distal sites. And what we found is we still get a spike in concentration at the boundary, but the source is more of this more mixed source. So basically, we're interpreting this as not necessarily evidence for full global wildfires, but that you've got some mixing happening here between the target rock derived PAHs. We also did, patterns size analysis or mass analysis. So this is an NMDS of PAHs from all our sites. They're coded by molecular weight. You'll see that NMDS1, the axis with most variability, once again, distributed by molecular weight. And if you plot the scores from the different sites, and we do this, the molecular weight proxy, you can see there's a really distinctive separation out between PAHs that have high values and low values. And what we found was that the source site, right, the Chicxulub site, had these really low values, and the further, more distal sites had the higher values that might be transport of these compounds away from the impact site. So together we interpreted this as more support for this excavated sedimentary target rock than necessarily global wildfires. At these distal sites, the source is mixed, right? So there's certainly some type of localized fire signal happening here, and there certainly is evidence that closer to the impact site there was large-scale wildfires, but I don't think that we can take this as evidence for like that mass burning of the whole biosphere. I think it's more complicated. Okay, so I want to talk about the last pH challenge, which is also related to pH distributions, but in a slightly different way. So that big, synthesis data set we did, I only really talked about what our results were on NMDS1, but we have a secondary signal here coming out on the second axis, where we have this one compound called retine, plotting out separately from everything else. And this is what the structure looks like. It's a functionalized pH, so it has not just a methyl group here, it also has an isopropyl group. And this compound is actually thought to be associated with conifers. And we actually found that when you code your samples by vegetation type, all of the woody gymnosperms are plotting out on the negative side of NMDS2. So certainly that's consistent with the understanding that this is derived from different acid or different resin acids that are created by these conifers. And so we basically defined this ratio. We call it the retine to 3-ring ratio. So it's retine over the other pHs of the same size. So accounting for those differences in properties. And you can see that there's a lot of variability here but most gymnosperm plants are plotting out with really high rectine values, while most angiosperm plants are falling below like 0.2 in this ratio space. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to move to our last case study, which is looking at fire response to the African humid period. Okay, so for the first case study, I was talking about shifts in fire when you're transitioning from a non-grassland setting to grassland setting. This is more thinking about fire and fuels in settings that are already open. So how do savanna systems themselves respond to changes in climate in interesting ways? And so this is like a pretty classic way that we think about this bistability between open savanna systems and tropical forests. So fire is really integral to keeping these systems open. And you can get a climate shift in one direction or back that puts you over a tipping point. So like if you have a lot of dry years or a lot of wet years. But there's a lot of stability in the positive feedbacks in this system. So what ends up being really important is rainfall and how that affects where sites sit along this gradient. So in arid savannas or drier savannas, these systems, the fire regimes in these systems tend to be limited by how much fuel you actually have to burn. And so what you find, and this is a really robust pattern from a set of data from multiple years in Africa, looking at the relationship between burned area and annual rainfall, is that you have a positive relationship between fire and rainfall in arid savannas. However, in more mesic or wet savannas, you actually have the opposite relationship. Because in these systems, they're not limited by how much biomass there is, they're instead limited by how dry the system actually gets in the dry season. So if you're too wet, you're not going to burn, even if you have a lot of fuels. Like tropical forests are a great example of like a fuel moisture limited system, right? There's a lot of biomass, but it's way too wet, so you don't get very frequent fires. So sites like this have a negative correlation between the amount of fire you get and the annual rainfall. So actually, what was observed then is there's this transition between these fuel load limited savannas and these fuel moisture limited savannas, and that occurs at about 800 millimeters of rainfall a year. And you can see where it kind of falls on this distribution of, so this is showing a histogram of savannas and where they fall in the rainfall gradient and tropical forests. And you can see that there's some overlap here between these and this mesic space. So this transition occurs, right here, about partway through the distribution of savanna ecosystems. And you might imagine, right, that depending on where you start on this rainfall gradient, your system could respond really differently to the same change in rainfall, depending on what your initial state is. So we wanted to test this on a long time scale that was longer than just, annual variability in the historical record. So we went to the paleo record, which is a great place to test these, large-scale dynamics that might be forced by a changing climate. And we wanted to go to a period we knew there was a change in rainfall. So the African humid period, or the AHP for short, is a period where there were large-scale increases in rainfall that were driven by orbital forcing. So this is, you might have also heard of like the Green Sahara. This is that time interval. So there are a lot of sites in Africa that got very wet for this time of year. And there's really great evidence for that. So we were using this event as a test case. And we went to 2 lake records in Africa, one that was on the arid side of the gradient, one that was on the mesic side. So Lake Turkana and Lake Victoria. We chose these records because we already had really good hydrologic proxies from the records, and we knew that they both experienced an increase in rainfall. So this is leaf wax hydrogen isotope data again, so similar proxy to what I showed earlier. And then this is the modern rainfall for these 2 sites. So we had some predictions for what we might expect to find at these different sites. So at Turkana, we predicted that either we're going to get this positive relationship between fire activity and rainfall, it's possible we might actually cross a threshold, if it got wet enough, from a fuel load limited site to a fuel moisture limited site. So we either expect an increase and decrease, or an increase and then a decrease and an increase again. So these were kind of the patterns we were expecting to see at the site. For Victoria, right, so we're either expecting to see a fuel moisture limited site, right, where fire is decreasing as you increase rainfall, or it's possible it got so wet that it transitioned to humid forest. That you stop fire completely, it goes over a tipping point, and you flip into this, tropical forest system. So to get at this, we of course measure PAHs, these sediments. So I used NMF to confirm that how much of these were coming from potentially a fire signal. And I want to just kind of take a moment to talk about an interesting result that we found at Turkana, which is when we ran our NMF analysis, we actually found that there was a third selected N member. And this N member is dominated by dimethylated PAHs. And this is really interesting because this is not a totally foreign N member. This has meaning. You can see that these conifer gymnosperms tend to be dominated by dimethylated PAHs. And that's because, if you'll remember that retine structure, right, it had a single alkylation and then it had that isopropyl group. These are also products derived from different resins, from conifer resins. So you could potentially interpret this as maybe a conifer component in our setting. And we basically took the third NMF N member and we plotted it against the retine 3-ring ratio. We found there's really good agreement. So we think at this site there's some type of gymnosperm burning that's also contributing to the record. We corrected for it because we're interested in grassland burning, but it's kind of interesting that this came out in our signal. We actually think this is probably podocarps that are more distal from more, a more Afro-montane component that's actually going into that record. So that's how we interpreted it as. But I think there's actually still a lot more work to do with thinking about gymnosperms in an African context, because it's a little bit more complicated than North America, where a lot of the data comes from. So anyway, future work. So first, for our pH records, because we're interested in fuel load dynamics, a lot of the times we correct our pH to a plant biomarker in our record to account for potential differences in transport, preservation, or fuel loads. But that's not necessarily appropriate here when you're interested in fuel load derived signals. So instead we plotted the PAHs against, or with, a beta-amarin derivative. So beta-amarin is an angiosperm biomarker. This is basically like an aromatized derivative of it that has a very similar structure to PAHs. It's an aromatic compound. And at Turkana, we found there's a really strong relationship between the two, and we didn't find that same thing in Victoria. And this actually makes a lot of sense, because this is what we expect to be our fuel load limited site. And this site we expect to be fuel moisture limited. So right off the bat, we're already seeing large differences between the dynamics of these two sites. So this is now PAHs, and I'm showing them as a flux, a sediment, in terms of sediment flux. We find that there's really different patterns at Turkana and Victoria. There's an increase at Turkana and a decrease at Victoria. So, moving back to our hypotheses for this, right? We find at Turkana, we actually have support for this first hypothesis, right? That we're in this fuel load limited site, and you've got this positive correlation between an increase in rainfall and fire activity. At Victoria, we actually see the second of the two hypotheses, where we're potentially getting evidence for flipping from a savanna to a humid forest system. This is actually backed up by pollen evidence in that same core. We see that you've got this decrease in grass pollen and an increase in tropical forest taxa. So just to end, I want to say that the last thing we did is we actually added already published records for a bunch of different sites to kind of fill out our gradient, kind of test these dynamics across a more robust spatial scale. And what we found is that all of our arid sites have this same fuel load limited pattern, where you've got an increase and then a decrease. We had two sites that indicated a transition from a fuel load limited site to a fuel moisture limited site. And then we had 2 sites that really showed this transition from a fuel moisture limited site to a forested site where fire kind of ceased completely. And I think the big takeaway here is that the Savannah fire response to rainfall is non-linear, but it is predictable based on where your expectations fall along rainfall gradient. Okay, so it's a lot of different different PAH stuff and different little case studies, but I just wanted to kind of finish by saying that PAHs can reveal interesting complex patterns in both paleofire and fossil carbon dynamics. That pH characteristics can distinguish both source and process. And finally, that we should continue to work to better calibrate these tools in modern settings. I think there's still a lot of open questions. And I always like, ending this particular talk with the Elder field proxy curve, where you're kind of moving from this overly optimistic phase to this, oh my gosh, my proxy doesn't work, I can't say anything, to this kind of realism phase, where you're able to actually account for the biases in your record and make, I think, much more solid interpretations. So with that, I want to acknowledge the many, many people that contributed to all the different parts of this talk, and I'm really happy to take any questions.
Great. And we do have some time for questions. I will let you just point to people if there's a question.
You can ask one, sir.
Yeah.
Just a very general question. What's the yield of PAHs? For however moles of biomass are in the ecosystem, what's the moles of PAH carbon you get out of that?
That's a really good question. And it's actually something we had to kind of think a little bit critically about with that big synthesis paper, because so geochemists don't think about pHs in terms of yields. They think about them in terms of grams of whatever material you're extracting. But environmental chemists think about them in terms of like how much biomass was burned. So we had to kind of think about how we convert what we're seeing in the sediment record to like yield. And I think it is on the scale of like, so first of all, I should say, I'm generally thinking about this in terms of total pH concentration. So we sum all of those molecules, all the parent molecules. So that's on the scale of like hundreds of nanometers per gram of biomass burned. When you go to experiments that have actually normalized it that way. But we actually make a recommendation in the paper that the way when you normalize to sediment, you're actually like doing a disservice to like scaling with fuel. And so we kind of advocated for normalizing to a plant biomarker to at least kind of scale with like how much is potentially burning. But like I said, that's not necessarily appropriate in every setting. So yeah, but I think one thing that I think doesn't always happen for burn experiments, sometimes hard to do that really quantitatively, because it means you have to like measure everything before it burns to calculate after, and I think that's sometimes challenging to do. So I think there's still some uncertainties with that.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely.
How stable are these things really? Like under
Yeah.
what range of conditions do they degrade, and how do you get them to do that?
It really depends. So there's certainly evidence of them degrading on the time scale of days if they're just in the atmosphere, right? So there is a drop-off in terms of like what actually gets preserved in sediments. They do get sorbed onto particles, and that helps protect them from degradation, right? So if they're, if the organics are stabilized by, inorganic materials, either like in the atmosphere or in sediments that are transported in the river or in soils, then that's going to help protect them on longer time scales. But it depends on the conditions. And I'll also say, right, like, and I mentioned this earlier, that some of the smaller ones are more susceptible to degradation than the larger ones. So that can definitely impact the signal that you're getting in the record. And so there's a lot of the ratio approaches is like a way to screen for degradation and things like that. You can actually, and I didn't really show any data here from it, but you can actually get a degradation signal in the ablated distributions as well. It's kind of the opposite of the pyrogenic signal, where you have most of the most ablated form and then progressively less. And that's because those ablated forms are actually more resistant to degradation. So I've actually, there's a record, I didn't talk about that study today, but there's a record we did in Australia that had a huge degradation signal in it. We were able to pick that out with NMF, but it was certainly present. We kind of interpreted it as this remobilized, degraded soil component that was coming into our record off the landscape. So, yeah, good question.
Any questions?
You mentioned the atmospheric transport component of it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're, within the paleo record, you're really able to dig into what type of fuel is burning. Can you do that with this measurement of the same kind of species within the atmosphere?
Yeah, so that's something I would really like to do, because those burn experiments in Kruger actually sampled smoke from all of those burn experiments, and I collected char, and I have all those samples sitting in the lab, and I really, really want to measure the carbon isotopes of those. Because one thing I'm really curious about is not just the source plant material, but like if the transport mechanism actually imparts a fractionation on the carbon isotopes, and that might affect how we interpret shifts in a sedimentary record. So that was something like we weren't able to do with that initial set because all those measurements were made on burn residues. But I'd like to do it in the data set that we collect, in the samples that we collected. So it's on my list. I'm like waiting for, I think it's like, it's either like a 1-year project for a graduate student, or it's an undergraduate student project, so I'm waiting for someone who's interested in doing that, and then I have the samples to kind of hand to them to take care of that. So yeah, no, but good question.
Any last questions? All right, well, let's thank Tyler again then for